Hi, welcome everybody, wherever you are in the world. As for registrations, we know people from over 68 countries have registered. And just for those of you who are new to our Heritage Matters series, this is our 19th Heritage Matters webinar. We were one of the first ones in India to start a webinar early last year. And our main goal is not so much just the tools and nitty-gritty of what heritage is all about, but more that to raise awareness that heritage matters, heritage in all its manifestations matters, and to discuss some of the critical issues. The way Heritage Matters is used is people register, or alternately, it's also posted on our webpage. They listen to the recording afterwards, majority of people. Some people see it on Facebook and YouTube because it's going live on YouTube and Facebook. And we got thousands of people watching as we go along in a week's time. And other people from universities, they use the recordings for their tutorials. And this recording is going to be used quite a bit, not only in the global south, but mostly in the global north as well. Because very often when they're teaching about indigenous people, there are no indigenous people around. So this webinar will become very important resource for them. So I wanted to give that overall idea of the Heritage Matters. Today's Heritage Matters focus is on indigeneity, what it is to be indigenous. What is indigeneity? What is the sense of place and belonging of being indigenous? And but we, thanks to the pandemic, which in a survey done by New York University and Abu Dhabi and Louvre, 73% of people said, it's quite a large sample, 73% of people out of that sample said the pandemic is an opportunity. So it's an opportunity for us to stop, think, rethink what we mean by indigenous and what is indigenous heritage. And to get away from coloniality, modernity, and patriarchy. So the triangulation of that is a challenge. The triangulation of climate crisis, the pandemic, and Black Lives Matter is another, triangulation. So we need to address both the triangulations. And that's what we are trying to do. In this, I want to mention the importance of everybody online checking out, or maybe Shagari can post them. The 2007 September UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's central, to when we talk about indigeneity. The other thing is that 39 museums and cultural centers and indigenous people from Northeastern India under the auspices of Indian Museum and Government of India, and hosted by the Don Bosco Museum in Shillong over an 8-day period, drafted, Karishma was there, so, and drafted a charter called the Shillong Charter. It's a charter is one, it's a soft law instrument for standard setting. There's no legal requirement to use it, but it's aspirational. So Sharvari can post in the chat box the Shillong Charter. It's on our webpage, so you can access it. But also importantly, UNESCO Director General, who absolutely affirmed the support of UNESCO for the UN Declaration in 2007 on the rights of indigenous people, made a statement, but by then already UNESCO had a program called LINKS, LINKS, with Ecology and Earth Sciences. And they were dealing with a number of projects. And UNESCO, with my former institution, that is Research School of Pacific and Asian Studies, Australian National University, also published the Endangered Languages of the World, which includes indigenous peoples' languages. So we have a very strong, international mandate for standard setting in terms of indigeneity, indigenous people's culture and heritage. What kind of new contract could we think about? So maybe by the end of this webinar, we'll have 6 suggestions that we can take forward. I myself, I hold the UNESCO Chair on Inclusive Museums and Sustainable Heritage Development for the Asia Pacific, and hence the focus on museums inclusion in all aspects, whether it's linguistic heritage, whether it's anthropology, whether it's museum interpretation, whether it's living heritage and community development. These are the things we're going to deal with today. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Well, we're going to start off because with Lisa for simple, I'm not going to give detailed introductions because everybody knows the people who come to Heritage Matters webinars, they Google everybody. Only then they join. That's a tendency. So let's go straight to Lisa from Rajiv Gandhi University, a linguist and a language heritage advocate, safeguarding language heritage. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Respected moderator for today's program, Professor Amareswar Galla.
UNESCO. Can everybody hear Lisa? Can everybody hear Lisa? Sharvari, can you check the sound, please?
Yes, she's audible.
Okay, sorry, Lisa. Let's go ahead. Okay, go for it.
So, respected moderator for today's program, Professor Amareswar Galla, UNESCO Chair on Museums and Sustainable Heritage Development, esteemed fellow panelists, greetings to indigenous people all over the world and to all well-wishers who've joined us today. I'll be speaking on certain aspects of the broad theme Indigeneity towards a new social contract, specifically on the subtopic assigned Linguistics and Language Imperatives. So scholars have pointed out the existence of distinct socio-cultural communities, which are far too numerous and dispersed in various geographical locations to admit to any inclusive description of them. For instance, referred to as Aborigines in Australia, Indigenous in United States, Maori in New Zealand, First Nations in Canada, tribes in anthropological discourse, as notified communities for administrative purposes, indigenous people in the discourse of human rights, Janajati and Adivasi in central, western and southern India, and preference of the term tribe as defined by the Constitution of India in the northeast of India. So tribes in Indian subcontinent do not form a uniform race, and it has been perceived in terms of its heterogeneity. What are the distinct characteristic feature of their religion, notion of territorial boundaries, languages they speak, unique structural features of social organization that is largely influenced by their economy as forest dwellers, agricultural farmers, pastoral transhuman communities, hunting and forager communities, and they are widespread across all ecological habitats, be it hills, forest, rural plains, urban and industrial area. Coming back to the Indian subcontinent, the languages spoken by these communities have been variously referred to as non-scheduled languages, oral languages, unwritten, lesser studied, lesser known, tribal minority languages, endangered languages, and heritage languages. And the diversity of languages spoken by the tribes in India is striking. One can find language across all the 6 language families identified in the Indian subcontinent, prominent being Indo-Aryan, the Meena, Gujjar, Baiga, Rathwa, Dravidian, Gond, Kurumba, Irula, Kuduk, Oraon, and then the Austric branch shows so much diversity. One, you have the Munda group, the Santhali, and then in the Northeast also, we have the Austric branch, the Mon Khmer branch, Khasi. And did we know that Nicobaris is also an Austric branch of language family? Fascinating when we look into the diversity of language families. Now, Tibeto-Burman constitutes predominantly the Northeastern languages, where we have the Bodo, Mizo, Bhutia, and then the Naga, Kok, Borok, Nishi, to which I belong to, and predominantly in the northeastern part of India. Then we have the 5th language family, the Tai Kadai, In Arunachal, we have the Khamti languages, which belong to the Thai languages. And the sixth language family, we have the Andamanis, Onge, Greater Andamanis, Jarawa, Bo. So just the diversity is the most striking and most unique feature of the tribal India. Now, what we come to focus is also that these tribal groups had intergroup relationship with the non-tribal population as well. And as a result of long, intense language contact, one of the striking linguistic feature which we can say for tribal speakers are most of them are bilingual in mother tongue and also regional languages like Hindi, Tamil, all the scheduled languages spoken around them. So in the process of long-term contact, we also have the twin process of language endangerment of the community as well as language retention, and it is an Indian reality for the tribal language speakers. Now, renowned linguists like Professor Anvita Abhi, Ganesh Devi, who have extensively worked with tribal communities in India, pointed out that creation of scheduled language list has been the gravest injustice done to the mother tongue spoken by the diverse tribal groups. The only two tribal languages to have been included in scheduled language list of India are Bodo, a Tibeto-Burman language, and Santhali, an Austric language, after a long language movements that spread across decades, and it was a tumultuous journey for these two tribal languages to get their place in the scheduled language list. We have to note that in 1949, post-independence, 176 Adivasi languages were identified, out of which 23 major tribal languages were also identified to be stable. Jaipal Singh Munda, the then member of Constituent Assembly, appealed for these languages to be included in the scheduled list. This is 1949. And with the reason, the inclusion could enrich the Rashtra Bhasha. However, these were categorized into minor language categories, although demographically these languages were stable. As a result, today, what we see is there is a hierarchical arrangement of Indian languages, status of English at top, major regional vernacular languages, which we can see the scheduled languages in the middle, and languages at the bottom are the tribal languages. And Mohanty calls it multilingualism of the unequals, as only certain languages have access to social, economic, and educational provisions. Now, the complex nature of what is a tribal language were explored by various linguists through decades, some of which are prevalent in usage, and I would just like to highlight for knowledge of everybody. So allegiance to a specific tongue is a marker of tribal identity. It's a very common feature. Language and identity is a prominent theme on tribal studies discourse. Why tribal languages have been equated with being primitive or underdeveloped, and often been stigmatized as being dialect and not a developed language. So the notion that the tribal languages are speech without grammar, these are not languages, but these are tribal dialects. And every tribal language speaker, when he goes out of his domain, has to face these very complicated questions. And now linguistics define dialects to be forms of speech that are mutually intelligible, while languages are too different for mutual understanding. Northeasterners, Northeast India, the tribe again has a different meaning, a tribe and language dichotomy. Whatever is spoken by a major tribe is called a language, and whatever is spoken by a sub-tribe is called a dialect. And we fail to recognize that language and tribe are in principle independent. So what is the meaning of tribal in linguistic context? And this dominated the debates on language studies. And some of the, so does the language of tribals reflect social, cultural, and ecological patterns through its grammatical categories, lexicons? Are there lexical features more prominent in tribal languages? Now, one of the most prominent feature which forms the intangible cultural heritage of tribal communities is the fact that it is oral languages. Now, oral languages have multi-layers of language use. Like we can say that a shaman or a priest is also a language specialist with different lexicon and language structure, which only the shaman or the priest possess and he knows. And then we have the folk songs, which are composed in literary genre. And then these folk tales and folk songs, which constitute the myths, the legends, again, these are composed in literary language, which cannot be used by anybody, any lay person. Only a knowledgeable person can use this. Hunters have their own language. Some of the tribes, they speak different languages, different language which is different from the spoken variety when they go to the forest. And then there are language for the dead. And many of these speakers who are not tribals, they don't know about these multi-layers language use. So when we lose a language, we are also losing all this knowledge system that is ingrained in language. And then coming back to the point, legally and administratively, the term tribal language does not have linguistic connotations. There is no linguistic definition of tribal languages. The Indian Constitution does not define tribal languages. The tribal languages are those spoken natively by the tribal communities, which are scheduled as per Article 342. A tribal community is defined for the purpose of scheduling on the basis of various historical, socio-economic, and cultural parameters, and language may be one of the cultural parameters. Now, so we see different literatures and also in Adivasi literature talking about the neglect and marginalization of tribal languages. And we have rich history of the insiders, the native speakers writing their own pathos, Adivasi, Vedna, and pathos. And then the other important feature is that the scheduled status gained by Bodo and Santhali languages opens up new themes of discourse for tribal language development. One realizes that script issues have never been an isolated phenomenon. Scripts are intricately linked to ethnic identity and is very political. For instance, Raghunath Murmu's invention of the Olchiki for Santhali script was not an isolated phenomenon, but was an integral part to his ideas about social ethics, the glorious past of the Santhal, and what it needs to be done to revive and regenerate its ancient culture, depicting glorious heritage through literature and reconstructing what was perceived as golden age. We see the same kind of social cultural movement and also the language movements happening in Arunachal also. So what we can see, the tribal literary organization like the Adi Agom Kabang developed almost at the same time as the socio-cultural movement of Doni Polo movement. And then this Apex literary body now continues to make huge contribution for the development and production of local languages, and which are now being introduced in the school education system. As linguist Lakshman Khubchandani explained, one of the facets of language use is to look at language as a vehicle of cultural identity, fulfilling the human urge of gratification through affiliation to a particular heritage. In the context of insecurity, such an affinity could find expression in emotive terms, as in case of one's religious loyalty. So similarly, in Arunachal also, we are seeing that the socio-cultural, socio-religious movement is very much intricately linked to the language development movement. And we have opened up a new indigenous model school, opened in East Kameng. And I hope that Galla sir will visit East Kameng once to see the indigenous model school in the Nishi community. And it's a path-breaking model adopted by the community. And the efficacy is yet to be seen, but there is huge reception for this new model of school. And then So the only problem that we see is we don't know that there are constitutional provisions for protection of rights of linguistic minorities. There are provisions, and very few have access or knowledge about these provisions. Now, the paradigm shift in linguistic studies, especially those focusing on field linguistics, and now majorly being undertaken under the language and cultural documentation, have largely helped in bringing focus to the intangible cultural heritage, specifically on the oral language communities. The team of linguists, both from the country and abroad, have been instrumental in bringing focus to especially the lesser studied languages, often categorized as endangered languages. And while producing grammars of the languages, the linguists have also contributed immensely to the language development initiative by participating with the tribal literary organizations, by producing not only dictionaries and grammar, but also helping the communities in developing orthography or working script. As a result, states' formal education and exposure to other mediums of knowledge, now one witnesses that tribal communities are transitioning from oral to written medium. And with the notion of written medium, so many other issues have opened up. Very uncomfortable debates within communities sometimes. Like, for example, in oral society, earlier, there was no authoritative narrative on genealogy or history or any body of knowledge. But now, after this elite notion intervention, people have started talking about my speech is more standard than yours, which we never, witnessed earlier. These debates, whose speech is standard, whose speech is non-standard. So we see a complicated debate now taking over in the language development discourse, and it sometimes becomes a hindrance on a simple, activity like development of script. So therefore, the sustainability lies on obtaining necessary linguistic training, specifically on the basics of linguistics, how to do language recording, and then it has to be given to the native speakers and empowering them to carry on the work of recording, studying their own languages, and giving us the native speaker perspective on the languages. It's getting down to basics, as we see, and adopting best practices in field, and also trying to close the gap that has been created by faulty approaches to studying the languages. So each one of us have to be actively, when I say each one of us, I mean the indigenous community. We have to, especially the educated, the literate members, have to be actively involved in all the aspects or any aspects of knowledge building and sharing, and which will eventually reflect broadly on policies for tribal language development. And lastly, I would just like to appeal to the policy makers that the Bodo and Santhali examples, they're finding a place, rightful place in the scheduled languages, was also because they adopted Indian script or a newly invented script. But what about the status of highly developed languages like Khasi or Mizo, which have been introduced at MA level, the postgraduate level in colleges, and they have used the Roman script for writing their language, but still they have not found their rightful place in the scheduled language list. So I think it needs to be addressed, and we can, we can really work towards equality of all languages. So this is what I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. My God, you've summed up the whole domain in such a short period of time. I think the many aspects that you raise, which need to be noted here, one is the cultural and linguistic diversity of tribal people in India, but it's the same thing applies elsewhere. I mean, the most culturally and linguistically diverse indigenous people in the world are in Papua New Guinea. It's not India, but Papua New Guinea. And in Australia, it's very culturally, linguistically diverse. And people are named, Anangu, Nunga, Kuri, Murray, by their own, what people call themselves, we the people. And so the first thing is the recognition of the cultural and linguistic diversity that you emphasize. Second thing is that there is multilingualism, as you say, but within that multilingualism, there are unequals. So I think that's something very important to take into consideration. Otherwise, soon there'll be more the process of assimilation and the demise of languages. The third thing that you emphasize, which is of importance for us within the UNESCO framework, is the intangible heritage. We will advocate with the UNESCO Convention Secretariat that they need to give greater focus to indigenous people and intangible heritage. As you say, the actual transmitters, the bearers and transmitters of indigenous cultures are themselves, not somebody else, not a museum, not somebody else. But then that needs to be done in the language of transmission. You can't do intergenerational transmission in a language other than the language of the intangible heritage element. I think you've raised a number of important questions, and we'll come back to this in the discussion. Thank you so much, Lisa. Now we'll move on to Karishma. Karishma, would you go next?
Thank you, Professor Galla. Hello, everyone. To begin with, thank you for having me, Professor Galla and Sharvari. I am actually very honored to be speaking with Professor Galla's, whatever Professor Galla organizes actually. But yes, it's an honor to be part of this webinar on the occasion of World Indigenous People Day 2021. Having said that, for the last few years, Department of Anthropology, Sikkim University has also been celebrating, organizing this event. And I'm particularly reminded of the theme in 2019, which we just talked about, which Lisa talked about in terms of the indigenous languages, because we sort of had a little survey in the department and we realized that we had people speaking more than 20 different languages. And out of that, 16 were part of UNESCO's Atlas of Endangered Languages. So that meant that we had about 16 languages that belong to indigenous communities, which meant that our department, a small department, actually had people from all these indigenous communities. So with that, I get to this point that India's indigenous people often belong to the scheduled tribe category of the Indian Constitution, with a total of 104 million people. There are approximately 500 tribes, Adivasis, who have their own distinct culture, ways of life. And while India voted in favor of UN Declaration rights of the rights of indigenous people, we also know that the Indian Constitution or Indian state does not consider the use of the term indigenous. And leading scholars, anthropologists, sociologists like Andre Bettel, B.K. Roy Borman actually refrain or are quite critical about using the term indigenous people in our country. Having said that, last few years, I've also heard a lot of scholars, even senior anthropologists say, everyone, when we say we're going to celebrate Indigenous Day, they say everyone is indigenous in India, or who is not indigenous in India? These statements are actually refusing to acknowledge the vast knowledge system that has been ignored or silenced by both colonial and post-colonial India. It is also kind of hypocritical, perhaps, of a discipline like anthropology, who has focused most of their work on the tribal people of India. I am also reminded again of Professor Khaka's words in a recent article, which he says, for anthropologists, it seems the tribal people they work with are mere subjects of study, little more than sources of data and information. Their pain, suffering, and humiliation, their imaginations and aspirations, the dispossession of their land and wealth and culture do not matter much. It might have been written in a different context, but it is still true of what is really happening in tribal India. Supreme Court ordered eviction of 10 lakh Adivasi families under Forest Rights Act because they did not have proper paperwork. We have all read of the predicament of these forest dwellers, and I quote Tikam Nagvashi, who says that we have lived here before they could write on paper, or the first car was seen here, or people knew what a map or a pen even was. The forest is our home. One can see the systemic manner of rendering someone homeless. There is a system that speaks on behalf of the majority, and the voice of minority indigenous people are either silenced or goes unheard. Hence, this year's call for a new social contract is fitting and timely because we have not been responsible anthropologists, citizens in standing up for the indigenous people of India, forget the rest of the world. In anthropology across the world, we are seeing an increasing awareness of acknowledging the crucial roles of indigenous people played in the making of colonial texts. So much so that these texts are often authorities on our indigenous communities and indigenous cultures. The role of indigenous people in the establishment of anthropology as a discipline is finally somewhat being recognized outside India. But in our country, we still reproduce the colonial text and refuse to acknowledge indigenous scholars because they might be biased in their scholarship. However, we do see an increasing number of indigenous anthropologists, scholars who are engaged in rereading, reimagining, and reclaiming these colonial texts. From my own experience as a Lepcha scholar, I know that Lepchas are probably the first people to have been written. I mean, Lepchas are probably the most written in when we talk about Sikkim, Darjeeling, Himalayas, but still very much invisible in the current context of geopolitical or even of this region as such. They've been described as simple, docile, no brawler. And of course, the most recurrent is born botanists. So much so that at one point, there was a joke that Lepchas died of eating some mushroom, which should not have been the case, because if you're a Lepcha, you should know all the plants that are, or all the ferns that are out in the environment. So having said that, there's also so much so also that during one presentation, somebody was speaking after me, and the person was also speaking on the Lepchas. They went on to say that Lepchas don't speak, they whisper. So forgive me if I'm not whispering. One of the quotes that I'd like to read is from MacDonald, who says that every Lepcha is a born botanist, born naturalist, and living as they do in the forest, they know the habits of every beast and bird and make first-rate collectors. They have a name for every living thing, including plants, which is found in their country. While these colonial writings romanticizes the natives as born botanists, it also reveals their knowledge of the environment and their ability to live off their natural surroundings. However, their role as indigenous environmentalists, if I can put it that way, did not come to the fore till Lepcha started protesting dams in Jonggu, North Sikkim. While it should have been a Sikkim issue or an Eastern Himalayan issue that there were dams coming to these mountains, because we all know after some years, there was this devastating earthquake in 2011, and it became more of just a Lepcha issue. And but having said that, during that time, we know that the struggle to safeguard ancestral land, especially with these projects, etc., is actually a shared struggle of indigenous people across the world. And in many ways, the Lepcha activists found solidarity with the worldwide movement of indigenous people rather than in their country itself. But no one is born indigenous, like no one is born Adivasi or a tribal. One sort of becomes indigenous or gets to that goal of it, because these are just state categories, boundaries, and historical structures that have dispossessed people of their land, language, and livelihood. On the occasion of celebrating Indigenous Day, I think it is important that we don't take indigenous people for granted. Indigeneity is often regulated, contested, and profoundly influential in people's lives, how they live. We do get caught up in finding or trying to find a universal definition for indigeneity, but perhaps our focus should be to acknowledge the different ways indigeneity is being experienced, articulated, and imagined across different communities in India. While being indigenous has global currency, sometimes it is the only place where indigenous people are also able to share their experiences. And of course, there are a variety of indigenous experiences and how indigeneity is often a power trope as marginal communities engage with state bureaucracies, tribal elites, and global culture. With the rise of international indigeneity, UN and ILO defined indigeneity in terms of historic continuity, distinctiveness, marginalization, self-identity, self-governance, and different scholars do have their own definitions. Of course, in the initial years, for the working group of people, India, the delegation from India was also trying to get tribal people recognized as indigenous people. But having said that, I think if we are too worried about, if we are at all worried about indigenous futures, it is perhaps the only way is to be in partnership with the indigenous people and not see them as the other, that anthropology as a discipline has been doing since its conception. Thank you.
Thank you, Charisma. That's great. There are certain things I didn't want to say at the beginning. I worked on Darjeeling Himalayan Railway when there was a certain amount of tension because there was no consultation with local people. So 2001, I was there all the way, from Siliguri to Goom and down to Darjeeling, Kurseong, all these places. I kept on asking, where are the Lepchas? They said, oh, they're not here, they're in Sikkim. I said, but before the Chogyal, Darjeeling was ceded to the Chogyal of Sikkim, it was 100% population was Lepcha in Darjeeling area. So I kept asking, there must be, where are they? So how can you talk about Darjeeling Himalayan Railway heritage without talking about the Lepcha who were there, who were 100% the indigenous population? Yes, the British, like elsewhere, they did, whether it's in Fiji or South Africa or Sri Lanka, they brought people from outside. They brought Nepalese and Bengalis and various other people, and they didn't employ local Lepcha people, and Lepcha people were displaced by the British, and a lot of them went into Sikkim. And so my first encounter was romanticization of Lepcha, especially Lepcha women with all the jewelry, sort of looking very exotic. And that's how they're dealing with the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway World Heritage Area. I think that decolonization of the heritage discourse needs to start there to understand. Second thing is that you emphasized and beautifully talked about the stereotype plus the reality, that Lepchas have the knowledge of the environment, sort of the biodiversity, plus the cultural values associated with the biodiversity. So for those people who are not from India, quite a few of you, and from different countries, I want to say Sikkim is the first state to go organic in India. 100% of the state is organic. In my opinion, this is largely because of the Lepcha people and their indigenous knowledge systems. That's what I always tell people. So it's a huge achievement, so for the Lepcha people and the indigenous people. And yes, the question of definition always comes up. I still remember I was working with the working group on world's indigenous peoples in Geneva. Sir Martinez Cobo, COBO, Sir Martinez Cobo scoped internationally with 90 countries and listed how people define themselves. And there's no one definition of indigenous, how people define themselves. Like I mentioned right in the beginning, Australian Aboriginal people, the indigenous people, Aboriginal is a British word. It's not an indigenous word. I mean, the Aboriginal people around Uluru World Heritage Site, they call themselves Anangu. Anangu means we the people. So like that, throughout Australia, there are indigenous names for people, how would they call themselves we the people. And so a lot of these things need to be, they're documented, but sometimes they're caught up in anthropological colonial discourse, and they need to be decolonized. and understood. So there needs to be scholarship that's decolonized. And as Charisma has been so eloquently talking about. Now we come to our third, thank you, Charisma, again, and we'll follow up.
Thanks, Professor. I didn't
Yes.
realize my screen was off, so I'm really sorry for everyone.
No, it's okay. Everybody can see you now. Don't
Yeah,
worry.
I'm really sorry about
It's
that.
okay. Now we come to the third speaker, Shakmacha. Now, before that, now that the maximum number of participants are there, I was waiting for this. Today is 5th of August, but International UN World's Indigenous Peoples Day is on the 9th of August. Why are we doing it today? It's very simple reason. On the 9th of August, everybody would be doing their own activities, but also many people won't be doing activities. One of the things Heritage Matters, what we discovered is that when we address an issue, have a webinar, a week later, there are many other people doing identical webinars. This includes professional bodies and everybody. So ever since we started as one of the first webinars in India in March, April last year, people have been, so it's about awareness raising. We're not doing the Heritage Matters webinars, which are free, supported by Anant National University, not because we want some academic credit. That's not what we're doing it for. We are doing it for raising awareness. So doing it today means there's a lot of raising awareness. So on the 9th of August, people actually recognize the importance of indigeneity, that we have to rethink. Why do we have to rethink? I think Karishma has and Lisa have mentioned that we need to rethink because anthropologists have a habit of going, collecting their data, researching, copywriting, going back, writing the books and articles without any understanding that they have a moral and legal responsibility to the people with whom they study. They do their field work. It's no more, participatory. It's far more than participatory. It's a community rights approach in anthropology that needs to be promoted. And those of you who are interested in how well this is being developed in Australia, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Studies has protocols, ethics, if you're working with Indigenous people. It's one of the best, and UNESCO uses this for the Intangible Heritage Convention. I don't know if Sharvari can find it, she can post it in your chat box. So we need a paradigm shift. That's why we're talking about a new social contract. And in this, for the UNESCO chair at Anant National University, the principal partner is the Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manas Sangrahalaya. It's a national museum, if you will, a national museum of anthropology. It's a national museum of people of India, all people of India, but it's a national museum that goes out of its way to honor and respect, tribal people of India and works with them. And it's one of the first national museums, or first museums in India to employ tribal people in India. I'm not saying other museums in the world have been that fantastic. I mean, Australia only started doing that in the late 80s. United States around the same time, with the National Museum of the American Indian, Canada at the same time. So many countries were starting to do it quite recently. So this is a very important partner for us, Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manas Sangrahalaya. They're co-hosts for today's webinar. I wanted the maximum number of people logged in before I mentioned it. So thank you once again to the director, Dr. Mishra of the Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manas Sangrahalaya for his fantastic collaboration, cooperation to address this. Dr. Surya Pandey and all the staff over there. But we're now going to hear from Mr. Shakmacha Singh, who's one of the first tribal people to work at Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manas Sangrahalaya. There are many others. Shakmacha, over to you.
Thank you, sir. First of all, allow me to give my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Amareswar Galla, UNESCO Chair for Inclusive Museum and Sustainable Heritage Development, my fellow panelists and audience. Although there is a little hesitation on my part because there are many senior curators all around in this field to who can provide very deep insight into the topic. But I owe my sincere thanks for granting this opportunity to share my understanding. I have been working in this museum for more than 2 decades, and I love my job, not just because I'm not working in National Museum, for the reason that this anthropological museum has deepened my knowledge in understanding museum and anthropology. I recall the moment when I was roaming around the galleries of our museum at the closing hour in the evening. I was reminded by a Hollywood movie, which we all cherished, The Museum at Night, which we greatly enjoyed, of course. I was asking myself, it may be a silly question, but it continued to linger on my mind. And I was questioning myself how they are going to introduce themselves, how the objects are going to introduce themselves. Are they going to tell the story on how they were brought to the museum, or are they going to yelp or cry to the way they have been displayed, stored, and interpreted? Maybe you find this question unworthy, but it certainly embarks on the validation on how museums provide an insightful story of indigeneity to the indigenous culture. Here, I believe the true challenge of museum curators lies. The question of contextual display and interpretation, especially in the anthropological and ethnological museums, need the participation of the voice that brings the true spirit of indigeneity, the voice of which Professor Galla referred to as the first voice. Referring to the census exercises carried out by different nations in the world, Jean Davy, Geoffrey V. Davis, in the book Indigeneity and the Nation, refers that 370 million of the world population is estimated to be indigenous. And it further states that according to the World Bank indigenous population data, the communities identified as indigenous on the basis of their location, uniqueness of tradition, social structure, and community law are close to 5,000 and are spread over 90 countries. Indigenous people constitute less than 5% of the world total population of about 7.9 billion people. According to the Anthropological Survey of India under its Mammoth project, People of India, out of 4,635 communities studied, 461 indigenous communities are identified and designated to be the tribes of the Indian subcontinent. 75 are categorized as particularly vulnerable tribal groups, and it nearly constitutes around 10% of the total Indian communities. Having cited above, the scenario of the community representation in the anthropological or ethnographic museum still shows a vacuum of gap to project the vividness of indigenous culture and their presence in a true sense to the national arena. I do not pose a question why, but a new approach of ethnographic museum deviating from the colonial frame of mind. And in the 21st century, where we started entering into a new digital era, it has given enough scope to work for the museum to be more inclusive. And I believe anthropology museum in India need to retrospect and look forward to a new contract or agreement where indigeneity and aesthetic sensibility of the indigenous voice finds a better place for expressing their culture and their presence. Indigenous material cultures collected and housed in the museum speaks a volume about its indigeneity. The collection that comes in the museum are inherent part of the community's culture and tradition. Apart from their typological and functional utilities, the objects also encompasses multiple stories to tell about their cultural landscape, natural environment, behavior, social values, and traditions. The question of indigeneity of an object in the museum can be better explained through the context of how it was collected and in what way it is presented. Yeah, let me share my screen, and I want to show some slides. How we bring the context of our collection and in terms of display in the museum. This is from our fieldwork in Majuli Island, where we notice some beautiful objects in the Shutter complex. In the left corner, you will find there is a metal container, a kind of bowl with a stain. We collected those items, but we left out the context. Here in the picture, you will find that a kettle for making a tea is suspended on an L-shaped wooden structure, which is fitted on the gums of a bamboo deep inside. This allows any of the strangers or visitors who visit them to take a warm hospitality and to enjoy teas in the family or in a village. You see, when we collect the object, we forget to bring the context, the knowledge and wisdom behind this particular object. If it is displayed in the museum with proper context, it gives proper information about the indigenous wisdom and their indigeneity. The idea of solidarity can be explained through museum object. Here, I want to explain from a collection. You will find an earthen vessel here, earthen a vessel for steaming rice. And it is hollow from the bottom, but the vessel is prepared by the potters community, and it was collected from Manipur, and the object is used by the Maring tribe, but it is prepared by the potters community. It brings a kind of a bridge. The object itself bridges the community. And while collecting, we found a very beautiful information which connects the two communities together. The tribe used this vessel in the preparation of rice during their feast-giving ceremonies. And in that ceremony, what indigeneity is reflected, we'll go to the next slide. In the feast-giving ceremony, you see the works are divided. The women folk, they engage in the preparation of rice, where the male folk, they cook meat of the sacrificed animals. But one important aspect you find here, if we see the right side of the photograph, where two men is engaged in the cooking of meat for the feast, they are using a loin cloth. It means that the person is responsible for cooking and serving in the particular feast. It indicates their indigeneity. At the same time, how these people harness the locally available material for which they use in the fish giving ceremony. You see, it is a gum sheet of bamboo, locally known as maribogwa. The gum sheet is nicely trimmed and cut. It is washed and used as a kind of plate for serving to the people. So the idea of sustainability is very much reflected in this. And when we talk about indigenous beliefs and worldview, we'll find one example comes from the Lamkang Naga tribe of Manipur, where we found how the indigenous community protect the age-old species of a tree. It is as deeply associated with their belief system. You can see the branch, the canopy of this tree. The branch is not at all allowed to fall down to the ground because they have a belief that if it falls to the ground, the world will end. The world will get destroyed. And another example I can cite, which comes from the symbolic representation and enactment of a divine through the in a festival of the Mopin from the Galo tribe of Arunachal Pradesh. Here, the divine father and divine mother is beautifully enacted in a bamboo structure. The divine father is represented by opo, which is a locally brewed millet beer or a wine, and a small enclosure, round circular enclosure downside represents the divine mother. We can see how the indigenous community showed a deep respect and understanding about their ecology and environment.
Thank you, Shakmacha. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you finished up beautifully and see how people respect, indigenous communities respect. I think you focused on contextuality right at the beginning, objects and contextuality. Next, you emphasize the multiple meanings and multiple communities that are involved, in not only making the object, but coming through together. I think you're doing amazing work, and you beautifully, gave some examples of contextualizing. And your last thing about worldview is one of the most important, that indigenous people around the world have their own worldviews. You don't have to impose something from outside on them. But trying to understand the worldview through the first voice, through the eyes of indigenous people, it requires a kind of education that, for in museology, in anthropology, every subject, new curricula, new pedagogy needs to be introduced. And in fact, for Professor Sari Chaudhary, who was one of the ones, and along with Dr. Mishra, that we started this whole partnership with IGRMS, he's been a very strong advocate that there's so much diversity, that multiple worldviews needs to be understood, but also the worldview. I mean, I think Dr. B. Venugopal, who is a former director of the National Museum of Natural History, and whose student is going to present next, Bibitha, he's been nationally, internationally advocating about documenting the environmental history, documenting the collections through the worldview of indigenous people is very different from just documenting from a parachute anthropologist or parachute museologist. So you raised a number of issues. I know you have lots more to tell us, and I think we'll do that one day around the fire, sit down and do it. Thank you, Shakmacha. Thank you so much. And in fact, just before you started, Dr. Kalyan Chakravarti was the director of Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manas Sangralaya. And he organized, you might have been there, a fantastic international showcase for 8 days with the World Bank. This was on sacred groves from around South Asia. And people actually came from different tribal communities. They created their spaces, but also people who were from communities other than tribal communities came, created their spaces, and talked about the rituals. So we actually had storytelling. We had actually papers presented, not inside, but on the site where they created their own sacred spaces. So it's a phenomenal institution that you work with. Of course, we look forward to a fantastic partnership in the future. Now, our last presenter is Bibitha. I think there's information already circulated about her. How are we going to do it, Sharvari? Can you start sharing or facilitating?
I, Bibitha, native of Varachal in Adirapalli Panchayat of Thrissur district. I belongs to the Kadar community, postgraduated in International Relations and Politics from MG University Kottayam in 2019. I was subsequently selected as one among the 6 candidates in India and the only candidate from Kerala state for the Tata Foundation Sambad Fellowship. At present, I am pursuing a 6-month online course in the Maharajas College, Ernakulam district in Kerala. I present the Kadar community, which has less than 2,000 people spread across Palakkad and Thrissur district of Kerala. We are a socially and economically backward indigenous community. We'll talk through this project presentation. Title of my project is Role of Kadar VSS in Intangible Heritage Tourism, a case study of Adirapalli and Varachal. The survey of Kerala Institute of Local Administration in 2008, and it is just 0.03% of the total tribal population of Kerala. Kadar are the food gathering, seasonally nomadic and forest dwelling community endemic to the Anamalai hills of southern Western Ghats. Food gathering is an ecologically viable subsistence activity as for the activities of the Kadar are concerned. The entire population of Kadar tribal community is distributed in the tropical rainforest of the Western Ghats in Thrissur and Palakkad districts of Kerala. This picture shows VSS, means Vanasamrakshana Samiti activities. VSS is an umbrella agency of Kadar tribes ahead of the State Forest Department. Objectives is importance of community participation in the intangible culture heritage tourism. Methodology is to 9 Kadar colonies and 11 VSS in the region of Varachal. COVID-19 made some limitations on field study. Funeral and death. A person on verge of death of given a little water by relatives. The corpse, wrapped in a fresh piece of cloth, is placed on bier made of bamboo, decorated with a plantain stem. Kadars perform dancing and singing with kural and janda around the corpse to make the spirit of dead appeased. All the members of the tribe, irrespective of gender and age, take part in the ritual with loud singing and dancing. The Kadar buries the corpse in a common burial place situated near the colony. The 16th day after the day of death is observed with a number of ritual and rite. The tribe speaks their own dialect. The language has strong similarities with Malayalam, Tamil language, and is without any scriptures. Almost all members of the Kadar tribe has a working knowledge of the Malayalam language. Musical instrument like kural, a windpipe, is a musical instrument and is used during the dancing and other rituals. It is an instrument with 7 holes, smaller than the clarinet, made out of the branch of pala tree. The chenda, a drum, is also used for rituals, ceremonies. It's made with the palm stem tied with leather in two sides. Preparing women waving puja performed before.
There's some error with the sound. I'll present again.
This picture shows a musical instrument named kural used by the Kadar community. Preparing temporary hut for rituals performed on the 7th day post funeral. Women waving coconut palm leaves used to make ritual hut. Puja performed before erecting the temporary ritual hut. In this picture, we can see a woman belongs to Kada tribal community collecting forest resources. Honey, turmeric, telly and medicinal plants are the main resources they collected. The Adirapalli Varchal Ecotourism constructed under Varchal Forest Division. What's now taking place is it's a place on scenic beauty and mainly on waterfalls. What is the issue of present ecotourism? There are biodiversity. Its duration, indigenous people work only as cleaning laborers. Tribal knowledge is vanishing without any records. Overcrowding and congestion make pollutions. Ecotourism make only enjoyment of these tourists. No knowledge construction is there, and as the part of this tourism project, displacement of indigenous people also take place. And what to be the ecotourism and what will be the advantages of ecotourism with community participation is first of all international ecotourism. Tourism society is that ecotourism is responsible travel to natural areas, conserved environment and improves will be local people. Based on this definition, sustainable tourism should be take place in the field of ecotourism, especially in the region of indigenous people and in the region. Area of my study, the unique ecological flora and fauna, geomorphological cultural significance, community-based ecotourism open insight to the tribal culture, biodiversity and tribal arts, and they should be heritage museum and it should be conserved under indigenous people, which makes no expectations and conservation of those unique culture also. This make the economic and social upliftment of local people. This is Adirapalli Falls and Varjal picnic spot. This river is a significant part of our cultural life. I think is to implement such a model which the participation of the community makes many benefits, such as one is the IH system opens new windows in the field of ecotourism, and second one is ecotourism will be community based. It will be responsible conservation oriented, and it will benefit in any economic and social way to the local people. And I hope if you with execute such a tourist uh, plan, then it will help us on a new window to the tourist, and another window will be open indigenous people for their upliftment and the conservation of their own culture and nature.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Babita. You did a great job. Can we stop sharing this? Yeah, yeah. Oh, okay, thank you. Now that's better. I think that's great, Babita. I think there are many lessons, many challenges rather, in terms of language use. You know, who considers your community as being backward community? That's a very colonial terminology. Backward to whom? And I think some of these issues need to be addressed both in curricula and in practice when we're dealing with Indigenous studies. And yours is an incredibly rich biodiversity area. In fact, the heartland of the spice trade and its hinterland. And the question with ecotourism is who benefits from it? Yes, Kadar community wants to participate, but who controls the infrastructure? Who controls the marketing? Who benefits from whose heritage? You know, who owns whose heritage? Who interprets whose heritage? Who uses whose heritage in tourism? These are fundamental questions that need to be asked. So, not all that long ago, I think 2013, UNESCO and UNWTO, UN World Tourism Organization, had a huge congress and a declaration in Siem Reap. This is near Angkor Wat. And out of that came a declaration jointly between UNESCO and UNWTO, which clearly emphasizes that there needs to be a benefit analysis, that people who are carriers and transmitters, like in your case, of knowledge, needs to be the primary beneficiaries of this. It's not often the case in the world. My own work in South Africa, I was very critical that post-apartheid, most of the infrastructure was owned by, was legacy infrastructure owned by people, not by, South Africans of all backgrounds, but by minority that benefited from the apartheid regime. Of course, there's some genuine cases, but the idea of ecotourism was so badly considered that in 2001, I think it was, or 2000, it was the UN year for mountains and ecotourism. Kofi Annan was the UN Secretary General, and the UN Working Group on the Rights of Indigenous People protested with him that this idea of ecotourism is very exploitative, and that we Indigenous people are used with this anthropological stereotype, and but we don't benefit from it because we don't control the infrastructure. So Kofi Annan is it's the only time that it's ever happened in United Nations. He took out ecotourism. So it became UN year for mountains, but he took out ecotourism because of all the protests that came not only from Indigenous people, but also countries like Vietnam and others who controls infrastructure. So I think, Babita, your coming onto the scene, into this network is very important as to who controls the infrastructure, who benefits from whose heritage. And these are not just issues for you. These are issues everywhere. I mean, in Australia, we're still struggling to deal with these issues, sort of a country which has made a lot of progress on Indigenous relations. And it's a very big issue elsewhere, big issue in many parts of Southern Africa. So keep at it, Babita. I think that we finished all the 4 presentations. We have time for questions. And so So the question that's asked is, how might this wisdom of native indigenous communities be better understood by bureaucracies within national, state, and local governments? It appears to be the only largest impediment to communities to self-govern. So that's the question. So anybody wants to answer? I'll read it again. This is all the important wisdom of indigenous people, but how do we educate the bureaucracies at the national, state, and local governments, not just in India, but everywhere in the world, I guess. Anybody wants to answer?
Hello.
Lisa.
Thank you, Chitra, for the question. I don't know if it will be a fruitful exercise, but then the place that I work, it's called Arunachal Institute of Tribal Studies. And we, the faculties, we got together and we planned on, developing a curriculum or a course content, short-term course content, targeting specifically the bureaucrats who are posted in Arunachal Pradesh. And it would be a short-term courses for the, maybe made obligatory by the government to undergo by the bureaucrats and administrators who have never been posted in tribal areas to know and get orientation about the cultural system, how to deal with the indigenous community, know about their language, social organization, to kind of I won't say administer better, but not have any kind of conflict with the indigenous community. And that's one area which often the educated people like us, we have to constantly be engaged in to bridge the gap between the the bureaucrats or friends from mainstream India, and also being the bridge for our own native perspective on very conflicting issues. So getting very practical, will the bureaucrats or the administrators take these courses offered by universities, diploma courses or short-term courses? So this is a very practical, because we do get a lot of queries from the defense sector, and sometimes from the very enthusiastic IS officers, why we don't have courses like this, and those who genuinely want to serve the place better. So this is one area. And of course, you might have heard about the Paras incident, where the YouTuber raised the question as to how Arunachal is part of India. We don't look like Indians. We are part of China, and and all this this problem that happened and how it was resolved, and the STSC Atrocity Act being in being in place, and then how he was jailed. And but from basically this crisis came the whole demand by the Northeasterns that there should be chapter of the Northeast or the tribal communities in the course curriculum or the syllabus, the CBSE, so it's also the approach has been mainstreaming the tribal communities, but I think now it should be looked the other way. What can mainstream learn from the tribal communities? How can we conserve environment? If the mainstream philosophy is not enough to deal with crisis, what are the other alternative philosophy given by the tribal communities or indigenous community to deal with the crisis that is happening? So maybe it's also to look towards the indigenous community for solving a lot of crisis that is happening in the world today. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Lisa. That's wonderful. I think that Anyone else wants to add? Well, I think Lisa has addressed the complexity of it, but also some very practical ways of dealing with it. And but also, when I looked at it not all that long ago, the curricula for training of IAS and IPS officers in Shimla and other places wherever they train, and myself and the late Dr. Kapila Watsan, we looked at it. We were really saying that this is where the difference should come. When they're actually being trained as civil servants, they must read the books that are decolonized. So how do we decolonize some of the training of our civil servants right at the beginning? It's not their fault if there's some misunderstandings, but I think that Lisa has suggested ways of dealing with it. Universities have a very important role to play. And the new national education policy of India that was adopted last year opens it up in many ways for people to rethink their pedagogy, make it more inclusive, develop more interdisciplinary education, and also provide portable credits. Sort of you could be studying at what university, you can move to another. So all these things, would help the future civil servants, because the civil servants are really, you can't really blame them all the time because they're a product of the system and the system of education. So we need to think about the system of education. It's in this context I want to mention that the UNESCO Chair at Anant National University, in partnership with Indira Gandhi Rashtriya Manav Sangralaya and the Central Travel University, where they offer a postgraduate diploma through IGRMS, and the Rajiv Gandhi University in Northeastern India, its Vice Chancellor, and the project led by Professor Sarit Chowdhury, and the University of Calgary, led by former Director General of the National Museum of Natural History, Dr. B. Venugopal, and his Vice Chancellor. We're collaborating to see how we can establish. We already have exchanged letters of intent to work together, how we can collaborate to create, immersions, international field schools, national professional development programs, and whether they're in the Northeast, whether they're in Central India, whether they're Southern India, that's not the issue. The issue is how do we create the curricular planning, the pedagogy, and the infrastructure for transformative learning. So, for example, one of the things we are looking at is there's some 28 people working in museums in India who all deal with, anthropological material. But the way they are collected are in a very colonial context. So how do they deal with it? So rather than asking me individually or Professor Sarit Chowdhury individually or Professor Kalyan Chakravarti individually, why don't we come together through an immersion, for example, at IGRMS, the 28 people, we build their capacity. I'm talking about museums, but the same thing could be these museums. There's been a lot of debate in the last 2 years by International Council of Museums on the role of museums in civil society. So IGRMS has a fantastic opportunity to provide immersions, capacity building for transformation mentalities of bureaucracies, academics, because I believe in India, a lot of academics also need to do transformative training because, in fact, while I was promoting this webinar through various networks, I got some very surprising questions from academics, which I would consider, if you ask them in Australia, we would call that racist, those questions. I was really surprised. So I think that academics also need to go through some kind of professional development programs. So that's what we need to do. This is the role of universities, like the way Lisa said, universities provide an opportunity, they provide platforms, and we'll all be working together. We're still scoping how we go about it. We'll be working together. Okay, any other questions? I'm just trying to see. How can we, the question is, how can we get closer to the communities to get better collaboration from there in implementing the tourism plans. Where does one start? The gang? I mean, maybe I'll leave it to the panel to begin with.
Sir, museum has a center stage to take a leading role for bringing the communities or going to the communities, which we often say as enrich and outreach activities. So the communities to throw a light on better collaboration with the communities, museum plays a very important role. The concept of eco-museum and people also ventures visiting the museum. So there are different ideas that museum can throw light on the aspect how better people participate in the museum, and mutually the curators pay respect to the concerned communities and bring to the forefront uh, about their culture, about their places, about their ecology to the limelight.
Thank you, Shakmacha. Well said. And I think here there's also some supplementary sentence. People who want to work with in communities. They're worried about their lands and privacy, that do not welcome outsiders. Well, we should ask the simple question: why are we doing what we are doing? Why are we breaking the privacy of other people? I mean, like I've seen not only in India, but in the 80s in Australia and many other parts of the world, people coming from outside, whether they're tourists or anthropologists, they think, I've seen this in southern Ethiopia when I was working there. People just think that they can just walk in. And I asked them, you live in a house, and if somebody walks into your front yard inside your house, would you think that's respectful? They said, no, we'll call the police. I said, well, it's simple common sense. What we won't allow in our own homes and your backyards, in our own communities, we have to learn first there what respect is all about. And you have to negotiate. I mean, if you know what you're trying to do, why you're going to a community, to visit, to study, to exploit, perhaps, whatever it is, you need to know what you want to do. And then you need to negotiate permission. In Australia, you not only need to get a permission, but you also have to pay for their time legally. Because if you're going to go and talk to people about whatever you want to talk about, you taking their time from their daily routine. You might be paid as an outside anthropologist for your salary. Sometimes bureaucrats get extra time, but why should people in the community give their time free of cost if you're going to get their knowledge of them? So in Australia, it's legal that you actually budget. How much time are you going to spend in the Aboriginal communities? And have you budgeted compensation, for their loss of income during the time that they spend with you? And I think these are the kinds of ethics we need to talk about and discuss. Now, there's a question here for you, Lisa. By the way, whoever asked that question, this is one of the things that the Calcutta Center for Creativity, they're going to offer a certificate program starting in October, November, KCC as it's called in Calcutta, on ethics of engagement. Please look out for it, ethics of engagement, because there are a lot of ethical issues in your question. Thank you for asking that question. Okay, next question is for Lisa. Can you please tell us, according to your perspective, what should be the main principles, or so to say, new steps to bring about equality and linguistic and language importance, irrespective of the differences it carries? Are you okay, Lisa, with that?
Thank you for the question. Actually, this is a very complicated issue. Am I audible, sir?
Yep, you're audible, yes.
I'll just give you a scenario, why it's such a challenging task. First of all, in my presentation, I did mention about some of the languages, so-called tribal languages, have not found their place in scheduled language, like the Khasi and the Mizo. Even if they have, their, courses, degrees, even they have PhD in their local languages. And how come, like, a late starter like Nishi community, we fail to understand why Mizo and Khasi, with all the development that took place in their language, could not find place in scheduled language list. And then the question of whether was it because the languages adopted the script Roman alphabet. And now this we need to kind of get a little bit clear statement from the, the constitution or from the government. So only those languages which used Indian script have made, and it could be my ignorance that I don't know the aspect why, Khasi and Mizo could not find a place in scheduled language list. Secondly, economic value has to be attached to teaching of the mother tongue. It is very, very sad situation when you look at the honorarium or the salary that the language teachers get. Like suppose there is a policy now in place, a national education policy, which which has the provision for teaching of courses in mother tongue, medium of instruction in mother tongue language. Now, and also simultaneously, there are also programs going on which introduces the mother tongues as a subject to be taught, like Hindi or English or Sanskrit. So in Arunachal Pradesh, we have been learning Sanskrit in from class 6 to class 9 or class 10, and you're given option whether you want to continue with Hindi or with Sanskrit. And of course, for percentages, many tribal children, they opt for Sanskrit to get a decent percentage. Now, in place of that, your local languages will also be introduced. The Nishi, the Adi, and all the languages which have working script with them and primers ready. Now, the inequality, I just want to highlight where the inequality comes. There will be no new post creation for language teachers, but an honorarium of rupees 2,000 was suggested for teaching your mother tongue. And then, as committee members, we like kind of, we got into kind of a little bit of, appealing why it's 2,000. It's a language equal to any other language, just because it's a tribal language, why are you paying us so less? The language teachers so less. And that's where the inequality also starts, showing. The people who make policy for these kind of so what I feel, if we can start with at least those languages which are taught in schools, which have been introduced in schools, tribal languages, if they also get equal salary as that of Hindi or English or Sanskrit teachers, that will be a very, very good beginning, to kind of establish some form of, or to go towards, getting equal treatment as to tribal and non-tribal or scheduled or not scheduled languages. So I just wanted to present this.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think the issue about the payment, we had the same situation in Australia in 1970s, 80s. So, anybody teaching an Indigenous language or even taking a cultural session, you invite Indigenous people to come on input in the 80s. They were paid less, a token sum. And So now it's illegal. I mean, it comes under the Anti-Discrimination Act if you do that. So I think that we all made these journeys in recent years very quickly. And I think I see a future that's very optimistic as long as we can share. Now, there's a question for Karishma. What is the difference between local and indigenous knowledge? We all get asked this all the time. Okay, Karishma.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks for the question, but that's a very, how do we respond as well, yeah? So what is indigenous knowledge? What is local knowledge? Not all knowledges can be indigenous, but indigenous knowledge can be local. Can I leave it that way? Yeah, I think I'll just leave it that way if that works. But of course, indigenous knowledge, yeah, maybe I shouldn't go too far. I think there are other questions as well.
I think you answered it beautifully in one sentence. And that's exactly the reason in 2001, when I was working in Darjeeling, I was asking for Lepcha people. I said, I want to understand the indigenous knowledge about the devastation that was caused by the British in the landscape by the kind of interventions they've made. And what is the indigenous knowledge about? Because, we think that, oh, great engineers did the zigzags and, the potassium loop and all of this. But a lot of that knowledge of the landscape was that of the Lepcha people who don't live there anymore. But we give that credit to engineers and others. Oh, potassium loop. These are some of the ideas of how you travel in the Himalayas, how you travel in the mountains. It's common sense from the Lepcha that was taken over. So local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, like you said, all indigenous knowledge is local, but not all local knowledge is indigenous. I think it needs to be understood, by people. And then, Professor Sarit Chaudhary is saying that we've all read Talak Asad. There is no denial of the fact about anthropological colonial past, but anthropology has moved beyond that frame, and IGRMS is an example. So that also addresses something else that somebody else has asked, is let's remember anthropology is no more a science of the other. It has the potential to do a lot. The discipline itself is not what we are talking about. It's the understanding of the discipline. It's the application of it. So there you, I think Dr. Sarit Chaudhary, Professor Sarit Chaudhary addressed that concern. And oh dear, there's a question, indigeneity and towards a new social contract. How does this social contract, how is it different from the French philosopher Rousseau's idea? I'm not going to get into this. We could be here all day discussing this. Here, what we meant by a new social contract is really what Mandela called the compact. When he came to sign the first post-apartheid, agreement with indigenous people, the Makuleki, Northern Kruger National Park on the Limpopo River, Mandela said, this is a compact. That means we reach an agreement, we reach a contract or an agreement that in next 5 years, we will change X, Y, and Z. Like Lisa has talked about various aspects of language heritage, and Shakmacha talked about contextuality, worldviews being embedded in the way we present and interpret our cultures. Bibitha talked about ecotourism, and the benefit sharing, and Karishma talked about rethinking, the discipline. And so I think I'll leave it at that question about new social contract. That's what we mean. We're not going into a philosophical thing about social contract in a much broader sense. Very important question, though. Then there is Question for Shakmacha. Do you feel the need to protect the indigenous objects and art used by the Pangal community in Manipur, which is going extinct to some extent, also neglected in major narratives? What would be the way ahead? Shakmacha, that's a question to you.
Yes, it is a very good question coming from Manipur, I think.
Yes.
The Pangal community, we, as a native of the Manipur, has closely woven into the fabric of Manipuri society. And I truly believe that the indigenous art used by the Pangal community needs to be collected, needs to be presented and interpreted as a native people of Manipur.
Thank you, Shakmacha. There is a very general question. The person who asked said it's very general. Are there studies on aspirations of indigenous communities in terms of aspects of change and continuity? These communities are having their younger generations in mainstream education. Is this bringing change in lifestyles and their belief systems? Who would want to answer that? Lisa, because you were referring to it before.
Okay, I'll try. What we are seeing is resurgence of, new, indigenous narratives right now going on in academia. Some of my friends from TIS, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and then JNU, and many, this new scholars who are writing on their own people, and so these are available, be it from sociological perspective, language studies, from anthropology. So a lot of local perspectives are being written by indigenous scholars. Some may say that the native scholars are yet to kind of reach that academic level, but we don't actually care. It's more important that we have begun writing our own narratives. And so People of India, People's Linguistic Survey of India was also one series which was published by Orient Black Swan. And so it was started by Ganesh Devi sir. And that's where the people themselves have started writing about their languages. So we do see a lot of local scholars writing about their own histories from their own perspective. And so also one thing, of course, there are many young, youngsters who benefit a lot from mainstream education. But even if you go to a very good institute, or you always face some kind of discrimination. Even if your merit is always questioned, even if you are a very brilliant student, your merit is always questioned. You got in because you belong to certain, social category. And so what I'm trying to say is, throughout the mainstream schooling, a tribal child goes through a lot of identity crisis. And as for like people like us, we found that we got back to our roots when we did courses like linguistics, where for the first time in a very reputed institutes, our teachers were training to teach us or record our own languages, or look at the structural features of our own languages and taking examples. And then somehow I think institutions, educational institutions, especially the teachers, play a big role in, giving the right orientation and training to youngsters to look at the conflict and crisis that they go through as adults also. So there are writings, a lot is being written by the so-called tribal intellectuals. You just have to kind of explore, but Virginia Khaka sir's writing has been very impressive, and there are many young academicians who have been influenced by writings of Khaka sir, and I can't recall now, but if you get in touch with me through email, I can send you list, because my own contemporary, they have also rewritten their own histories, totally discarding what was written about them by colonial anthropologists or, non-native scholars. So this is going on right now.
Thank you, Lisa. I think there's nothing one could add to that. Lisa is so eloquent in the way she answered it. I mean, even taking this webinar, an all Indigenous first voice webinar, because I've been attending sessions where they talk about Indigenous issues, but they're not one tribal per voice. And it's actually listening to voices, and learning from voices. But anyway, Lisa has interested. There's a question here. I think, Bibitha, I know you might want to answer this. The question is, sorry, the questions are being flicked across me. How can we, Bibitha, are you there? Bibitha? Hello, Bibitha? I think she's got connectivity issues. I mean, this is how can we mainstream this indigenous knowledge in development theory and practice. One could simply say, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, that's exactly what it's asking is listen to indigenous people. And don't, if you're going for development projects, they need to be, the ownership should be with indigenous people. Ownership and accountability also is with indigenous people. It's about equitable participation. It's about benefit analysis. It's the final outcomes, benefiting in development for the primary stakeholders who are the indigenous people in the projects that you're dealing with. And so I don't know if Bibitha is able to log in and say something about it. Bibitha? Sharvari, is she there? Can you check? Okay, so then there is another question. Thank you for very pertinent and important areas of ethics. Could you also highlight national and global consortium for tribal and indigenous community cultures? The simple answer is there are many organizations. The Permanent Secretariat of the UN Working Group on World's Indigenous Peoples used to be in Geneva, but now it's in Copenhagen. So you just need to Google, some of these organizations, and so you'll find them. But ethics, I'm glad that you talked about ethics, but this is one of the things that whether it's International Council of Museums or International Association for Anthropological and Ethnological Sciences, everybody internationally, they're dealing with ethics, as an important area, but also in the ethics of engagement, the role of indigenous knowledge as we talk about climate crisis, not suddenly going off for trying to exploit knowledge, but actually understanding how indigenous people have been looking after traditional lands and historically the whole world, if you will. And Bibitha has audio issues. Apparently, they got heavy rain in Kerala. Those of you from India, you know what heavy rain means in Kerala. It means heavy rain. But international people might not. You might not know that Kerala is evergreen forest area. It's very heavy rains, a lot of flooding, floods, and everything at this time of the year. Now, I want to, how much time have we got? I think that we got 7 minutes. How about I just, if sum it up, I think what's coming out is if you want to safeguard the indigenous heritage or tribal communities, you got to do it in the language of the communities. And the mother tongue, the first language, is in which first voice of the people can be safeguarded, and that this is critical for the sense of place and identity of people. And so language heritage, language maintenance, language development too, because I think Lisa referred to question of multiple language situations. So no language, no culture is frozen in time. And so they keep evolving. So the first thing is understanding language heritage through research, promoting language heritage and language maintenance through policy. So we're not very good in policies when it comes to main language maintenance. I think we need to advocate for it, but understanding the complexity of it, that we are multilingual. We could be fluent in our mother tongue, but we could also be fluent in other languages. Like English is my fourth language, and I'm talking to you in my fourth language of learning that I learned as an adult. So we are still trilingual in most parts of India, but it's all changing, to monolingualism because of the imposition of English, for example, in the state of Andhra Pradesh. And but we need to do second thing that we need to think about is how do we create a platform or a forum for professional development of public servants, heritage professionals, for anthropologists who want to undergo professional, especially younger scholars and linguists and any other discipline for that matter. Can we create a forum? And this idea that I suggested that we're discussing is that the UNESCO Chair facilitate University of Calais, Rajiv Gandhi University, the Central Tribal University, and IGRMS, that we try to scope this. We've been discussing it, we'll scope it. That's the second thing. The third thing is the question of ethics. Can we actually look at the ethics for various disciplines in our countries? I'm not just talking about India, because the majority of participants in this webinar are international. And so how can we look at the code of ethics? Like for instance, in Australia, we looked at the code of ethics for Australian Archaeological Association several years ago. We modified, we made it more appropriate, respectful, inclusive. In fact, the scholar who actually led this in Australia is now the president of World Archaeological Association, Professor Clare. And so in our own countries, can we look at the codes of ethics of anthropological associations, nationally archaeological associations? How can we further make them appropriate, respectful, inclusive, treating indigenous people as equals on equal footing? Can these codes of ethics be translated into languages other than English and whatever the mainstream language is in your country? So the third thing is about ethics of engagement, right? That's what I'm gathering. The fourth thing is very important one, is before the pandemic, tourism was the biggest growth industry in the world for almost 18 years. During the pandemic, tourism is almost dead in many parts of the world. But now, all strategies are for rehabilitating tourism in a post-pandemic era. The desperation is so much that UK has put emphasis on jabs, on vaccinations. The sooner they get higher vaccinations, the sooner they can open up to tourism, industry, trade, and so on. And what does tourism mean? And Sharvari can post, we're hosting a conference where Bibitha will be one of the speakers next year in June in Muziris in Kerala. It's a major international research conference on tourism. We're going to put emphasis on built environment and design, but also very strong emphasis on indigenous perspectives. So if Sharvari, if you could copy that link to that in the chat box so people can copy that. And so what is responsible tourism? So Sharvari, so far she already posted it to everybody. So open that link and save it. We also have a professor from Nigeria. She was the head of tourism department at the University of Africa. She's just joined us this week. So she's also going to assist us nationally to coordinate discussions on, ethics, taking indigenous people into consideration on cultural and heritage tourism. So that's the fourth thing. Fifth thing is that how can we, like we have the Shillong Charter, people in the Northeast know about it, but then researchers from Delhi parachute, they pick somebody as a partner. Anybody who's traveled as a partner, they get a grant to do their research in Delhi, wherever. So this is tokenism and exploitation of people. They know about the charter that you shouldn't be doing this. So how can we use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? How can we use the Shillong Charter? How can we use the facility of the Constitution in India, for example, to develop more engaging partnerships so that these charters make up, meaning how can we advocate with UNESCO so that the 2003 Convention on Safeguarding Intangible Heritage, puts more emphasis on, it does already address more emphasis on indigenous intangible heritage and issues associated with it. So that's one. And finally, what I want to do is I want to work out that we all work out models when we talk about inclusion. Let's not work on binaries. Let's not just say, okay, this is indigenous and this is other, because then we perpetuate the self and the other paradigm, which doesn't help anybody. What we want to do is we all want to learn to work together through reconciliation. There's been historical wrongs. We recognize them. We go for reconciliation approaches like Australia is, and we work together, because at the end of the day, we all have to work together, because whatever is called the mainstream is very diverse culturally and linguistically. And whatever is called the mainstream in terms of industry, we all have to compete for jobs. We all have to work together to contribute to the best of knowledge systems, best of industry, best of trade, best of tourism, for example. So those are the 6 things that I'll leave you with. And I think that we've reached, it's 4:30. So I'm going to, Bibitha is online. Bibitha, hope you're okay, safe with all that rain. But anyway, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Shakmacha. Thank you, Karishma. And thank you, Bibitha. Thank you, Sharvari, for facilitating everything. And thank you to all the wonderful people that are still there. I see Dr. Venugopal, Professor Vanessa, a lot of the people, so Professor Sari Chaudhary is still there. So a lot of people are still there from all over the place. And I also see some of my Australian colleagues, and they're internationally. So really appreciate, this is very important. 5th of August, hope on the 9th of August, the actual UN World Indigenous Peoples Day. In all your institutions, you hold seminars, activities, celebrations, feasts. And of course, if you hold a feast, don't forget to invite me. I'll try to, come somewhere or the other, because I like good food with tribal communities. So be safe, whatever you're doing. Take care, and thanks to the panelists, thanks to all the participants. I'll say goodbye now. Okay, bye for now. Bye-bye. Take care.